Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Learning Future podcast. I'm, of course, Louka Parry, and today we are speaking with a phenomenal educator who's really sitting at the intersection of so many different things happening in education and technology and learning. We're speaking with Justin Reich. He's an associate professor of digital media at MIT. He started his career leading outdoor expeditions and teaching wilderness medicine, taught high school history, and then worked with schools on technology integration. At MIT, he studies how schools use technology and how teachers learn to improve their work. He's authored several books, including Failure to Disrupt, Why Technology Alone Can't Transform Education, and Iterate, The Secret to Innovation in Schools. He's a fellow podcaster. He's the host of the Teach Lab podcast. And at the moment, they have this fascinating series called The Homework Machine, which is really trying to delve into the implications of AI. He's also the director of the MIT Teaching Systems Lab. Justin, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Louka. Thank you.
I'm really excited for the conversation, of course. My first question, what is something that you are learning currently that is kind of forefront of your mind?
The thing I learned today, which I gave a workshop at Harvard
Nice.
for educators across the university who are just trying to help their various schools work on AI-related things. And whenever I do these events, I'm always trying to collect stories. And the one that caught my attention today was a law school professor describing how some of their Socratic seminars aren't working anymore. I think the way it
Interesting.
works, although consider this like not fully reported, not fully vetted yet, just like,
Sure.
anecdote. But the students are graded on their participation, so they prepare. They're increasingly preparing with GPTs, and they're getting outlines of conversations for previous years. So they can they essentially can over-anticipate the kinds of questions that are going to be asked, and they prepare responses to those questions. And so the conversations are not having enough variation, and they're not having enough kind of interesting missteps or
Multi.
moments of uncertainty. It's basically like a series of prepared answers. And apparently in some of these classes, it's really flattened out the utility of the Socratic discussion. And that just struck me as like such an interesting puzzle, because one of the things that we tell educators is, oh well, if you're having a problem with AI assessment, then you just need to be like doing more in-person
Do a
stuff,
Socratic
and you just
seminar.
need to be doing more authentic. Like this is pretty in person, and this is pretty authentic, and but it's not working. Because of the really subtle ways. I mean, it's probably a story about the importance of friction.
Yes.
Is that we need friction and resistance and heterogeneity in our learning environments for interesting things to evolve, and GPTs have flattened that out. There's also this, to me, there's this like totally dystopian kind of like, here are all these people paying all this money to come together in the same place, and the machines are kind of feeding them scripts, and the scripts that are being generated off this text corpus that means they're homogenized and so forth. And in some ways it's just like absolutely terrible. But it's kind of fascinating too to watch this particular moment of breakdown.
There's so many topics I want to go through. The big one, right? And it's something we're reflecting on a lot of the Learning Future too, is this idea of friction is fuel, and the idea of frictionless digital experiences. The distinction between learning and performance, I think, is what you're calling out here. If you can prep so much for performance, you're bypassing the learning. Of course, there was that viral MIT study, which was a small sample, not peer-reviewed, that have talked about cognitive debt last year. Take us a little bit into your world, Justin. Like what are you seeing, and how are schools grappling with this?
Yeah, so I think in moments of change and complexity in education, there people should not listen too much to elites. People should be careful about listening to professors and pundits and people at think tanks, and should really try to listen to students and teachers who are in classrooms. So staying really close to practicing educators, because like elites are just saying things and making things up and are pretty far away from the action. And folks who teach every day are right in there. So as GPTs arrived, one of the first things we did, we started this project called the Homework Machine, where we interviewed 120 students and teachers across the country. At the first question in our interview protocol is just, how's your year going? Like, what's going on? And for some people, actually, especially in the United States and more affluent places, AI is really like the thing they want to talk about. This is the thing that's like causing challenges, messing up our schools. I mean, they would say messing them up or whatever they would say with it.
Mm,
And of course, in lots of places in the United States, the problems are chronic absenteeism, the problems are poverty, the problems are violence.
mm.
AI is the 17th or 97th thing on the list. And, I think what students in and teachers in K-12 schools told us was, just a story of uncertainty. That like the old practices are not quite working, the new practices have not come into being. Um, and schools are not well set up to manage extended periods of uncertainty. It's just not a thing that historically we've asked the U.S. education system to do. I doubt it's what people have asked the Australian education system to do. And, I mean, your listeners will know, but not everybody realizes just like the extremely small margins by which these schools operate. Like if 6 middle school teachers call in sick, like the building doesn't work anymore. Like children are being
100%.
supervised by a janitor in the cafeteria. Like there's not this huge overhead staff with which to manage change. But, I was talking to folks that, it's that same person at the Harvard Law School was saying that like what's happening in the profession is changing and is uncertain. And if you're at a law school, what you do is you look to the legal, your job is to prepare people for the legal profession. So you look to the legal profession and say, all right, what's going on? What do you need? And we're going to make people who can do that. But if the field itself is in a state of uncertainty, then the school is kind of stuck in this uncertainty. So I think that's, one of the places that I've ended up most is thinking about like what kinds of supports could we offer to schools that would help them deal with unfortunately like pretty long periods of uncertainty and to strengthen some muscles in that regard, which is going to be hard.
You're someone who gets to speak through story a lot through the podcast. And these 120. I want you to just double click on that practice comment that I think is so important to remember. We always used to say in education, everyone has a view on schooling because everyone's been to school, by and large. Now, everyone's played with AI to some level, so everyone has a view on AI. As someone's kind of like listening to these stories of practice, like how are you seeing people manage that uncertainty well, and where are you seeing it absolutely fall in a heap?
Yeah, I would say the educators have a natural and in many circumstances positive, healthy, to be celebrated reaction to seek best practices. If there's a group of elementary school teachers and your kids are not learning to read very well, you should not invent reading instruction from first principles. You should go find experts and say, experts, tell us everything that we've learned over the last 100 years about teaching reading well, and do what those experts, I mean, you're gonna have to modify it for your local circumstance, not about being slavish, but like, we know how to do this. I think for the foreseeable future, like automatically turning to like people who are seeking best practice, you're just going to find folks who are saying things without evidence. There is no best practice for how to manage the arrival of GPTs in schools. And so you don't have to look for, I was talking to an educator the other day who was like, oh man, there's all these AI literacy frameworks out there. Which do you think is the right one? I was like, they're all made up. They're all too early. None of them have good evidence behind them. It is very likely that substantial portions of them are wrong and substantial portions of the ideas behind them and the suggestions for executing them are wrong. So I think, unfortunately, seeking best practice, which works in lots of circumstances, is probably not the best strategy here. I think the best way to manage uncertainty is through kind of what I've been calling local science. You
Nice.
look at your community, you identify some of your strengths, and you say, okay, we think that maybe the best way for us to navigate this pathway forward is through this kind of approach. And that approach could be, man, we really got to find a way to preserve the very best parts of our instruction and kind of keep AI at bay. Or it could be, man, there's some places here that we really want to invest. I mean, I was in this room of Harvard instructors today, and there are some folks who are like, we've got to figure out how to preserve really important things that we do. And there are other folks who said, our fields are being transformed and we have to transform our instruction. Those are
Mm.
both reasonable bets. So then you choose some of these things as a community, and you put some experiments out there to try them, and then you assess whether or not the things that you're trying are working. And the main thing that we can do to conduct these, like the simplest form of assessment, is we look at changes in student work. Most of us are not completely transforming the what of what we're teaching. Like if you had, a pig dissection in 2019, you probably still have a pig dissection in 2026, and there's going to be a lab that goes along with your fetal pig dissection, but you're probably either putting in a bunch of new rules to keep AI out of it, or you're probably introducing a bunch of new policies to allow AI into it. So you grab a bunch of pig dissection lab reports from 2019 and you grab another set from 2026. In the best of all possible worlds, you mask all the names and you shuffle them up and you read them so you don't know which is which, and you say which of these works is evidence of the kinds of biology thinking that I want to see, which of them is showing the mastery of content understanding, the mastery of the procedure we're trying to get, your anatomical knowledge, your sense of how systems work. And are the new things that we're implementing, are they amplifying the things that we most care about, or are you getting assignments back where you're we tried to keep the AI out, but it's clearly in there, or we let the AI in there and it people are saying crazy stuff now, or the work is so much better. We gave them a new set of tools and we're pretty confident that the thinking is improving. But I think that, that's local science is, I think, for the foreseeable future, the way through uncertainty. You make some bets and you try some experiments, and then you do some assessments to see whether or not the things you're doing are working. And then you're really courageous about looking at things that are flopping and going, okay, we're not doing that anymore. We're going to, try something else.
That's fantastic. I love that framing of local science. It's kind of science, art, craft, the whole idea. I'm really curious about this idea around assessment, right? It's like one of the biggest questions for us in higher education, in K to 12. And something you said, about how do we judge the thinking? It used to be the case that we had an assessment task that would be completed. And of course, it was a proxy in some ways for a learning process, capability, which was about clarifying thinking or learning structure, or whatever the case would be. Take us into this world of, learning v performance and, the potential positive use cases that you're seeing, and of course the negative use cases, because there's so much going on in this kind of, everyone now cheats versus everyone now is supported to think properly. It's too binary, of course. So give us some nuance.
Yeah. I definitely don't think I have solved it, or anybody else has. I think there's just interesting things to explore in there. I'm not ready to jettison all of the assessments that we used to do. I don't believe in things like, oh, if GPT can do it, people don't need to do it anymore. It's no, you the thing that makes us creative, the things that makes us proficient, is knowledge that's in our head and the structures of knowledge that are in our head. And one of there are lots of you have to assess what kind of knowledge is being shoved in people's heads as you're assessing how they do more complex things. I teach a class called Learning Media and Technology. And at the end of the class, they have to do they do a project about whatever they want. But the first assessment in the class, asks them to do some writing about learning theory. I basically say that there's sort of two big camps of learning theory, one that's more like direct instruction and one that's more like apprenticeship. And I have them do some exercises where they write about these two ideas. And I think some critics of what I do would say something like, man, that doesn't sound like, the writing you have them do doesn't sound like it's super authentic. It doesn't sound like it's a real project. Why don't you just get them doing real work? And I'm like, dude, if I don't know that they understand these basic ideas about learning theory, they are very likely to do stupid projects that go off in the weeds and make no sense, because my job is to first make sure that they have the grounding that they need to do more complex things. So the answer is not going to be turn everything into authentic. Like, we don't have time to turn everything into authentic projects, and authentic projects are dumb when people don't have the work that they
Actually,
need to do
no.
authentic, the foundations they need to do authentic work. On the other hand, obviously, like, there are a whole bunch of things in which we don't want students to, there's got to be a class of boring rote work that we don't need people to do anymore. Um, but I think there's a group of scientists that organize around this idea of called cognitive load theory. And there's a bunch of interesting things about it. But I think one of the hearts of their argument is that it is rarely the case that the best way to train people for elite performance is to do the same thing that elite performers do. Like, you don't, every athlete knows this. Like you don't become an elite soccer player by just playing games of soccer against other elites, although that's important. What you do is you decompose complex practice into specific tasks, and then you do a variety of kinds of drills and other exercises that develop automaticity at those specific tasks. And there's all kinds of intellectual things that we do that have the same dimension to them. So, like, what people need to learn is changing, the kinds of scaffolds they need to change. I mean, if I were to break it down to the simplest things, though, I would still say the more you're in the core of the curriculum, the more you're in, like, the heart of the tested things we do, probably the more that you have, or more that people down the line depend on you. Like, if you're teaching statistics 101, there are people teaching statistics 201 and 301 that are really depending upon you to make sure your students achieve certain kinds of understanding. And for those things, we probably ought to come up with a bunch of assessment systems where people really can't use AI, and that we know that they, in their heads, have some capacity, at least for the foreseeable future, before we shake out, like, which things we just don't need humans to know at all. The more we're in the periphery of the curriculum, the more those are safer places for explorations. And the periphery can either be things that are, like, untested or stuff like that, or also, there are courses in which we sample from a canon rather than move from a sequence. So in, like, our literature classes, we sample from a canon. There's way too many books you could possibly read, so you just, like, pick a few of them, and if you do, like, if you do 4 Shakespeare plays instead of 5 Shakespeare plays, it doesn't mean that students, like, learning is permanently crippled. Like, you have, like, if on the 4th Shakespeare play
Absolutely.
you're just doing wacky AI stuff, that's great. Don't do wacky AI stuff with, like, 8th grade algebra.
Yeah.
Don't do it in the
Yeah.
places where, like, all the rest of the maths are depending upon students developing certain kinds of understanding.
I love that distinction, Justin, between pulling from a canon versus pulling from a sequence. The idea of developmental continua, as being part of this new way of understanding growth, new metrics, even the idea of transcripts that are a bit broader, but still have this kind of developmental progression inherent within them. I'm really interested in your view on even just, like, super basically, the like just solid use of GPT. One thing that I would say is that many students are still using GPT as a learning assistant, and that's problematic because of the cognitive offloading, cognitive debt issue, versus a tutor. And this idea of the study modes, or Khan Migo, and a whole bunch of others that you'll be familiar with. What's kind of the basic principles for using these tools to help your learning or to help your students learn? Because they're going to largely use them anyway. So how can we get a bit of guidance to them? And I know you've done some fantastic work and released a great report last year that kind of spoke to this somewhat.
Yeah, although I would say that the report we released, maybe I'll tell the whole story of it, which is
Yeah,
that my
please.
staff came to me and said, "We want to write an AI guide to schools." And I was like, "Absolutely not. There are 800 AI guides to schools,
Already,
and we're
yeah.
not writing the 801st AI guide to schools. Like, it's not helpful to people." And they went and talked with the folks, the educators we've been working with, and they're like, "No, we're going to write a report." I was like, "Okay, fine." But there are 2 rules. One is everything that's in it has to be from a practicing educator. So no pundits, no professional learning people, no think tanks, no thought, like, just practicing educators. And second, we have to tell everyone, like, very clearly from the beginning, that we have no idea whether or not anything in it is right. Um, so I mean, I really don't think there is a great answer to your question yet. The Harvard
Mm,
physics department did a study where they replaced a bunch of in-class active learning experiences with, GPT physics tutoring experience, and students did better. So if you're Harvard students studying physics, that's pretty applicable to you. It might not be applicable to like the vast majority of other people. I mean, one of the things we know is that, digital learning tools often particularly benefit already educated, already affluent people. Now, some of your listeners may work with already educated, already affluent people, and then it's like, all right, let's let's
Mm-hmm.
bust out the GPT tutors. Um, there's another study that Edie did with DeepMind, where they had GPTs giving advice to human tutors who were sort of screening the advice for people giving math help. Um, and the benefits were measurable, but they were extremely small. They didn't have huge breakthroughs. So I mean, and then I mean, especially as people, there are definitely cases of AI psychosis and AI mania,
Mm,
people who develop these really unhealthy relationships with these tools. And so like, I don't, if we induce an Australia-sized, nation of children to spend more time talking to GPTs, like what fraction of them are going to descend into psychosis or mania? And like, is there a tolerable fraction, or should schools just like not be in the business of encouraging people to talk to GPTs? All these things are not
fascinating.
known. Um,
Yeah.
and so I think some of the principles that I would use to guide my experiments would be talking to students and teachers about their like co-creating these experiences with them. That's something that I do with my students at MIT. We're constantly talking about like, is this thing helping you? Is it not? Um,
Mm,
uh, really thinking about the age of people. So I think as folks are older, there's probably more room for experimentation, and I think there ought to be like a lot more caution, a lot more parental discussion, a lot more discussion with school leaders and things like that about experimenting with younger kids, and then some form of assessment of work product. If there are people out there who are generating experiments where like they're trying some kind of tutoring routine and the students like it and the outcomes are better and people don't seem to be going crazy, then it seems like, all right, well, let's keep doing some of those kinds of things. But I think a lot of the folks who are trying these kinds of experiments are finding out like, um, oh, this is not, we're not getting positive outcomes out of this. We're getting, we're getting experiences where there's a veneer of quality in the work that people produce in the short term,
mm,
and there's not proficiency in the long run.
mm. Yeah. Again, what I'm really struck by, Justin, is kind of your humility, actually, in this conversation. On the one hand, you could be like, "Oh, this is," and you hear a lot of pundits saying, "This is what you need to do," and a lot of kind of the sparkly, shiny object syndrome that we seem to have. Have you tried the new model? Versus what's the impact on learning? What's the impact on cognition? And I want us to talk just a little bit about that impact on cognition, because it's certainly like a signal soon to be trend that I see this in some ways like a pushback against ed tech and big tech more generally with what's going on in California. And I'm just really curious about your view as someone that's been across this for decades, working in this digital media technology learning schooling intersection. Where should technology, where should we just not use technology at all? I mean, I think some schools, for example, are just pulling laptops out, and so whole countries, by the way, also, as you know, are also removing all the technology from the classroom, realizing that when these things also remove friction, and friction, that productive struggle within the cognitive process, is literally the biological process of learning. So, have you got like, what's your kind of musing on that at this point in history?
Yeah, I mean, for me, one very personal thing I feel is that when I started teaching in 2003, my students
Huh,
didn't
okay.
have lots of daily interesting intellectual engagements with computers and the internet, and that was something special that I could provide as a teacher. Um, and now I feel much more like my undergraduate students are glued to their phones in unhealthy ways, are isolated from their classmates. in social situations in unhealthy ways, and that actually a special thing I can create for them sometimes is spaces where they get to be with one another and be in connection to other people. And that's not because the sort of the actual capacity of technology to support learning has changed. It's because the context of their lives has changed. So that's one thing that I think. Um, a second thing that I think is like a challenge in educational systems is that or just like an unusual feature is that it's usually more important um, to get one system right than it is to pick the one right system. So there are going to be school systems in the
Nice.
future that get rid of all of their technology and do outstanding in-person instruction with materials and with students in social relations with each other. And those students are going to be happy, productive people who go on to contribute in lots of different ways, including technology-rich ways. There's also going to be schools that try that and do a lousy job, and their students are not going to be well prepared. By contrast, there's going to be schools that are like, we are going to AI all the things, and there might be some of those places that AI all the things who do it really well, who create really rich learning experiences, who get like a lot of these delicate balances right, who attract students who are sort of into those things. And there's definitely going to be schools that AI all of the things, and their students are not going to be well prepared. So, I mean, another way of saying it, there's more variation within models than there is across models.
Nice.
But I think, I mean, another thing which is just the case is that education technology companies have not delivered on their promises. They have not, particularly in like core tested subjects. It is really hard to find evidence that that these technologies do a lot to improve literacy, to improve mathematical fluency, other things like that. And then the other problem over the 25 years that I've been teaching with them is that they've gotten worse. They are more, like, I mean, the thing that we could have thought 25 years ago is like, man, these phones are awesome. Like they connect us to the world's information, but they're kind of distracting sometimes. And they're only a little bit more connected to the world's information than they were 25 years ago. And these companies are just spending billions of dollars a year optimizing their capacity to hijack our attention and put it on advertisements. And so there are, I mean, I don't know, there's a line of sort of like AI think leader pundit people that are like, oh, the AI you use today is the worst AI you'll ever see. And I think some of that is true in the sense of the underlying technical capacity of the technology. But these companies have gotten so extremely good at like hijacking user communities and turning exploiting their eyeballs for value in other places, so that the consumer it's quite possible that the consumer experience of AI tools, as they include more advertisement, as they include more sponsored content, as we're seeing them include more sexualized material and like other things that we don't want anywhere near schools, like they absolutely could get much, much worse. And all of those kinds of changes are going to determine what that are going to shape the kinds of hard choices that schools will need to make. Maybe the last thing that I will say is, for people's lives, they're going to learn doing stuff with the internet. If you live in the networked world, as soon as you leave school, there's all kinds of stuff that you're going to learn from the internet about beating video games, about doing your hair, about, I was fixing my snow thrower, which is probably not a problem you all have a lot in Australia, but I had to rebuild the
Not
carburetor with
particularly.
our last blizzard.
Have you got it
And
done? Yeah.
I think if we don't have learning experiences in schools with adults where we help people get good at learning online, that seems to me to be that seems to me to be a thing that I would be very cautious about jettisoning from school. If you told me that we're not using, online reading apps anymore, and that we're doing most of our writing by hand, I would be like, oh, there could be, like, I'm interested in people trying that. When people are more into like just no technology at all, then I'm like, there's a lot of cool learning that you can do if you can be connected to the networked world, and you'll probably be better at it if adults help you. So I mean, those are a lot of different things. That was not one
No, I
answer
love
in there.
that.
There was like four of them, but
I'm loving it, Justin, honestly. Do you know, I think maybe just I want to talk about agency and your view on agency, because I think implicit in that view, in terms of, an AI first school versus a low tech school, is this idea of becoming an agentic human being, which means being able to act instead of being acted upon. And your reflections, which I would call, surveillance capitalism or the attention economy, all the other books that's been written on them. And I think, just to flag, I am very curious about the attachment economy, which I think is already underway. And there's some other people talking about that, like Zach Stein and others. It was dopamine, now it's dopamine and oxytocin, and that's problematic. But there's something about, how do you just create the conditions for which a young person steps into the world, still with a life of learning, by the way, but they've stepped out of at least one of those rites of passage out of high school or into college, or maybe out of college into the workforce, whatever the case might be. And they have expertise, but they've also got agency. And I just wonder about that as a really key theme for the future of learning, knowing that if we create all these achiever type, and this is Jenny Anderson, Rebecca Winthrop's work here, you might have seen the disengaged teen. Just, if you're all in achiever mode, you're highly engaged, but it's low agency. And then you step out into a landscape like the field of law you were talking to, where it's about what you do with what you know, how agentic you are, the questions you ask, how you prompt your suite of agents, to work alongside you, your paralegals, et cetera, et cetera. What's your reflection on how to cultivate agency, including with these tools or without these tools?
Yeah. I mean, almost anything, the way we cultivate it in educational systems is by giving people part task practice that leads to whole task practice. It could, it could be for agency or swimming, or writing or lots of other things. You say like, what are circumstances where people really step out? I went to this wonderful talk by a guy named Carlo Rotella, who's at Boston College and teaching their freshman lit class, which he does he's been trying for like a fully AI resistant way. They're a class of 35, so kind of big for a literature class. And he has this rule that all of his students, there's a grading policy that you have to make a contribution every class. And in particular, he makes sure that every student talks within the first 2 weeks. Now, what happens if a student doesn't talk within the first 2 weeks? He basically like brings them into office hours a couple of times, and they talk about why the person is not talking. And then he says, okay, this is the question that I'm going to start class with the next class. Here is the reading. Go work on the reading a little bit and then come back to me and tell me what your answer is to this question. And then if he needs to, they like rehearse the question in office hours. He like asks the question and the person says the thing and they're like, great, that's what we're going to do at the beginning of class. And then everybody feels like they're a full contributing member to class and they have that like wonderful breakthrough experience of being a talker and a contributor. And he didn't use anything that's different than any coach or anything else. It's just like, well, let's practice it and then you'll do it in front of other people. But I also think
Nice.
for some of the biggest challenges we have in society, we should not assume that education is going to solve this problem. Like there's sort of famous, your English would probably know, like the marshmallow test, which was the idea of like, you put a marshmallow in front of a kid and say, if you don't eat it in 10 minutes, you get 2 marshmallows. And people thought for a while that it was like a measurement of people's sort of individual capacity to, suffer in order to have future gains.
Delayed
But there was
gratification.
like subsequent evidence that suggested that basically if you grew up in an affluent household, you did better on the marshmallow test than if you grew up in a resource constrained household, where like future gifts were less likely to come around and things in front of you. So actually maybe what makes agentic people is like people who are well fed, people who have stable homes, people who live in safe communities. And schools can be part of that. But I don't know, there's a saying that every time the French have a problem, they hold a general strike. And every time the Americans have a problem, they make a new class, which is to, make a new course, which is to say that like schools are pretty amazing, but they are not going to solve all of the problems that we have in our society. A bunch of these, it's going to be like social movements that solve these problems,
Yes.
not, the agency class.
Yeah. No, it's just such an interesting thread. Here in Australia, we have quite a lot of conversations at the moment about the kind of theories of learning. It's really kind of, we're in this, kind of combination between your inquiry-led or your explicit instruction. And it's an interesting dichotomy, and I think both are useful and both are tools, but there's something beyond that. But the other question is, we always talk about is excellence and equity, Justin, and this equity to me is this idea that you can have agency in some way. So it can't be a class that you take. It has to be experiences you have, including ones that meet your needs. And so for me, when you think about the biopsychosocial model of health, we sometimes in education, we do also just consider, well, the instruction is the most important part. But as when I was a school leader in an outback school, it was so clearly the case that it was actually all the other preconditions that needed to be met. And so if we're going to have high agency, like talent is universal, opportunity is not, there's definitely something else about, in some ways, restructuring the way that society works for children to thrive. And where societies fail to do that, that is a malfunctioning society where the incentives have kind of been completely co-opted by certain interests. And I think we're seeing that take place in many societies around the world at this point in time, not least of all the increasing complexity, the hot war that we're currently experiencing as this goes to recording. It's just such a devastating and yet fascinating thing to kind of consider. There's not much to say about that after.
No, that was your piece. You got to
piece,
express that vital idea, and I was just letting it linger there.
You're just letting it.
I agree.
Expand. So I guess then, just to come to a close, if we were to have this conversation in 10 years' time, I'd love for you to talk about a scenario that you see. And again, nothing's guaranteed. But what's kind of a scenario that in some ways you're fighting for through your work, through the way that you amplify voices of practitioners and students, the work you do across the teaching lab? Like, what's the scenario in 10 years that it's a bit like your North Star for schooling?
So I don't put a lot of credence in theories that like something about new technologies will completely transform education. Like that hasn't happened for the last century. I don't think it will happen in the decades ahead. And if it does, it's not totally clear to me that we'd be really good at preparing for it. So it seems like preparing for the things that we know make a lot of sense. I think I'm really hopeful that 10 years from now, instead of saying, we're living in this world of, constant uncertainty and you have to do all these local experiments, we'll be like, hey, first of all, there were a whole bunch of big science experiments we did where we have giant randomized control trials where we can tell you do you need to know how to teach a kid to code with a Copilot? We totally know how to do that. This is what Google does, and this is what Amazon does, and this is what other software engineers do. And here's what you can teach a fourth grader, and here's what you can teach a seventh grader, and here's what you teach a 10th grader. Today you could not do that. You could not give people that kind of accurate guidance. But I think in 8 to 10 years we will be able to. I would hope we would be able to do the same with things like research and knowledge finding. I would hope we would do the same with writing. If big science doesn't get us there, I hope that there's more accumulated little science. I hope that there are sort of more networks of schools that are we're a group of 30 outback schools, and we've really found across the 30 of us, we tried a bunch of different policies for addressing GPTs, and the ones that seem to be kind of working are these ones. And we're continually revisiting them in one way or another, but, we're revisiting them less and less because they feel more stable. I don't think, historically we've asked schools for the most part to teach kids how to read and write and be nice to one another and do some math, learn some other things about the world. It's not clear to me that those things need to be sort of totally transformed. I think they still could be a pretty good foundation for using all kinds of digital tools. In part, I guess in part I feel that way because I think we're going to find that it's actually not that hard to use AI in the sense of getting AI to spit stuff out. That what's really hard is discerning the quality of output. And that what makes people good at discerning the quality of output is domain knowledge. There's not, people who are really good plumbers who use AI are not going to have specialized AI knowledge. They're going to have specialized plumbing knowledge. That's going to let them know the AI, if it's off its rocker here, I need to find another one. Or, that was a really creative plumbing solution. I'm going to try that. And then, fixing this thing or something like that. So it's a very conservative view, but I think the history, we are in our second century of technologists coming to schools and saying that this new technology is about to transform what we're doing. In 1913, Thomas Edison said that in 10 years, all text would be gone from schools and be completely replaced by film strips, which did not happen. So we're sort of 100 years into this journey where betting on more or less a stable system with some uncertain components has been a reasonably good bet.
I love that, Justin. It's a good history teacher right there. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Beautifully said. All right, final question for you. It's been wonderful to have you talk about some of your views and elevate the perspectives of people working in schools. What is your take-home message to the listeners of this podcast about the future, about learning, about schooling, whatever you want to leave us with?
Yeah, I think if you are a practicing educator and you're feeling like, man, things are uncertain, I feel like we should know what to do here. We do not know what to do. We do not know what to do. And actually, a lot of times our early guesses are not that good. And so if like that's terrible and feels bad, but maybe it feels a little bit better knowing that, my colleagues at MIT, the people I talked to today at Harvard, the folks at lots of other schools that I've talked with around the United States don't have any better answers. But many, many educators work in communities of smart, caring teachers who have the energy and the courage to come together as communities and try new things. And so I think as people pursue a sort of agenda of like local experimentation, local science, are going to iterate towards some things that feel like they work better. They'll do some evaluation along the way, and they'll share what they're learning with their colleagues. And, hopefully some of that local science will coalesce into something that looks more like best practice. There'll be some really cool big studies that are done that are funded by the EU or the US, Australia, that all from top down give us some big science answers. And some of this uncertainty is going to be resolved. But we don't have to be a rush to get there. We can just accept like, these are the challenges we have. We're going to have to bring a lot of humility to what we're doing. And, and also like the GPTs are so weird. They do such weird stuff and they're doing such weird things to people in society, and kids love that stuff. Like I think like a safe place to lean into and explore is like just how bonkers everything is. And, playing with that is fun. That's kind of the vibe that I'm sharing, and people can decide. We'll see whether or not history validates that as a reasonable point of view.
I love that. I love that, Justin. Super playful. There's something beautiful about all being in it together. So thank you so much for joining us on the Learning Future podcast.
It's a pleasure. I hope you all are having great success in your experiments, and I hope people check out the Homework Machine, the Teach Lab podcast. We've got 7 episodes of great stories of the lives of American educators, and I'm sure they'll resonate with what Australian and other oceanic Pacific educators are wrestling with.
It's good down here, mate. It's all going well. Yeah, check out teachlabpodcast.com, and also the Guide to AI in Schools, which was a fantastic report, Perspectives for the Perplexed, which Justin tried to not release, but his team overwhelmed him with suggestions from schools and students. Thank you so much, mate. All the best.
You bet, Louka.